They wanted my fence gone. Fine. But what they didn't realize was that my property wasn't just any property. It was the property that made their precious lakeside community worth millions. And when I was done with them, let's just say the HOA president went from driving a Mercedes to begging the bank for mercy. You won't believe what happened when I discovered the one thing they never saw coming. My name is David Chen, and for 8 blissful years, I lived in what I thought was paradise. Lakewood Estates wasn't just any community, it was the community in our county. Nestled along the pristine shores of Lake Morrison, with private beach access, a championship golf course, and homes that started at $800,000, it was the kind of place where people waited years to buy in. I bought my property back in 2015 for $650,000. It was a corner lot, which made it more expensive, but it came with something nobody else in the community had: direct access to the main road and the lake. My backyard literally opened onto a private beach area. The previous owner had installed a beautiful white picket fence along the property line, perfectly maintained, exactly 4 feet high, which was the maximum allowed by county regulations. Life was good. I worked from home as a software consultant, making around $200,000 a year. My wife Sarah was a pediatric nurse. We had 2 kids, Emma and Jake, ages 7 and 9. The fence kept our golden retriever Max safely in the yard while the kids played. Our neighbors were friendly. We attended community barbecues. I even volunteered for the neighborhood watch. The HOA was relatively quiet back then, managed by a reasonable board president named Tom Williams, a retired firefighter who believed in common sense over bureaucracy. The monthly dues were $150 per month, which covered landscaping of common areas, the private beach maintenance, and the security date. Reasonable, fair, no drama. Then, Tom moved to Florida to be near his grandchildren. That's when Margaret Sutherland took over. Margaret was a 62-year-old real estate agent who'd lived in Lakewood Estates for 15 years. She drove a white Cadillac Escalade with vanity plates that read, "Sold It." Her husband Richard was a semi-retired attorney who spent most of his time golfing and intimidating people with casual mentions of lawsuits. They lived in the $1.2 million home on the opposite end of the community. Margaret had run for HOA president 3 times before finally winning. And the moment she took office, everything changed. The monthly meetings went from casual gatherings of 20 people to mandatory attendance affairs with printed agendas and Robert's Rules of Order enforced like constitutional law. The dues increased to $225 per month. New rules appeared seemingly overnight. Your grass couldn't be taller than 2.5 inches. Holiday decorations could only be displayed for exactly 2 weeks before and 1 week after the holiday. Cars couldn't be parked in driveways overnight, only in garages. Mailboxes had to be a specific shade of black, available only through an approved vendor that coincidentally was owned by Margaret's nephew. But I followed the rules. All of them. My grass was manicured like a putting green. My mailbox was the approved shade of black, Sherwin-Williams Tricorn Black, $45 for a tiny can. My car slept in the garage every single night. I even took down my Christmas lights on December 26th, though I thought it was ridiculous. I thought if I just followed every rule to the letter, I'd be fine. I was wrong. It started with a letter in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. Official Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association letterhead. Certified mail, signature required. Dear Mr. Chen, it has come to the attention of the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association Board that your property contains a non-compliant fence structure. My hands actually shook as I read it. Non-compliant? My fence had been there for a decade. It was there when I bought the house. It was inspected. It was approved. It was grandfathered in. But according to Margaret's letter, the HOA had revised its interpretation of community standards, and all fences were now required to be visually harmonious with the lakeside aesthetic. My white picket fence apparently was not harmonious. The letter demanded I remove it within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day. I immediately called for a meeting with Margaret. She agreed to see me the following Thursday at 6 p.m. at her home, which should have been my first warning sign. HOA business should be conducted at the community center, not in someone's personal mansion. Her home was exactly what you'd expect. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a living room that looked like a furniture showroom. She offered me tea. I declined. Richard sat in the corner reading a newspaper, but I could tell he was listening to every word. "Margaret, my fence has been there for over a decade," I started calmly. "It was approved by the county, it meets all height requirements, and it was grandfathered into the HOA rules when I purchased." She smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "David, the fence may meet county regulations, but Lakewood Estates has always maintained higher standards than the county minimum. We're a premium community. Your fence, while functional, simply doesn't align with our vision for the neighborhood's aesthetic future." "What does that even mean?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "It means," Richard interjected from behind his newspaper, "that the HOA has the authority to revise and enforce community standards as it sees fit. You signed the CCRs when you purchased. You agreed to abide by all rules, including future amendments." I pulled out my copy of the CCRs. "The CCRs require a community vote for major rule changes. This affects my property value and my family's safety. My dog needs that fence. My kids need that fence." Margaret's smile vanished. "The board voted unanimously. That's sufficient under our amended bylaws." "What amended bylaws? When was that amendment made?" "Last year. We sent notice to all residents." I never received any notice. I checked my records later that night and found nothing. When I contacted my neighbors, only 3 out of 47 households remembered receiving anything about amended bylaws. All 3 were on the HOA board. But it got worse. 2 weeks later, I received another letter. This one informed me that my property was now in violation for unauthorized vehicle parking because my wife's Honda CR-V had been parked in the driveway for 15 minutes while she unloaded groceries. Fine, $50. The next week, violation for non-approved garden decorations. We had a small garden gnome Emma had painted in art class. Fine, $75. The week after that, violation for improper waste receptacle placement. I had put my trash cans out the night before trash day instead of the morning of. Fine, $50. I was being targeted. It was obvious. I looked around the neighborhood. 3 houses had cars parked in driveways all weekend. 7 properties had garden decorations way more elaborate than our single gnome. Half the community put trash cans out the night before trash day. Only I was getting violation notices. I attended the next HOA meeting with documentation of every violation I'd photographed in the neighborhood. I had a PowerPoint presentation ready on my laptop. I'd printed color copies for every board member. Margaret wouldn't let me present. "This meeting's agenda has already been set, David. If you want to raise concerns, you need to submit a written request 30 days in advance." But she banged her gavel. Yes, she had an actual gavel. I submitted my written request. 30 days later, my agenda item was mysteriously removed because the meeting ran long due to unexpected business. The fines kept coming. By June 2023, I'd been fined $1,200 for various violations, all of which were selectively enforced. I refused to pay them. The HOA placed a lien on my property. Then came the nuclear option. In July 2023, I received a letter informing me that because of continued non-compliance with community standards and unpaid fines, the HOA was initiating foreclosure proceedings on my property. They could do this because I'd signed the CCRs, and the CCRs gave the HOA the power to foreclose for unpaid dues and fines after they exceeded a certain threshold. My $650,000 home was going to be taken from me over a fence and some made-up violations. Sarah was in tears. The kids knew something was wrong,
I'd stopped sleeping. My work performance was suffering. I'd paid $3,500 to a real estate attorney who told me that HOAs in our state had broad authority and that fighting it could cost $50,000 or more in legal fees with no guarantee of winning. Margaret had won. She was going to take my home. That's what she thought, anyway.
I spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing every document related to my property. The original purchase agreement, the survey, the title report, the county records, the HOA bylaws, every single piece of paper I'd signed or received over 8 years. And then I found it. Buried in the original title report from 2015 was an easement agreement that I'd never fully understood. The language was dense legal jargon, but as I read it more carefully, a particular phrase jumped out. Perpetual access easement for recreational use granted to property owner and heirs in perpetuity, covering lots 47 through 52 and Common Area Section C. I pulled up the community plat map. Common Area Section C was the private beach, the crown jewel of Lakewood Estates, the entire reason properties here sold for $800,000 plus. Every single home in the community had access to this beach through the HOA's common area designation. But my property had something different. Not just access through the HOA's permission, an actual easement. A perpetual, irrevocable legal right that predated the HOA itself. I called the title company. After 2 hours of being transferred, I finally reached a title officer who confirmed what I was reading. When Lakewood Estates was developed in 1998, my corner lot was the access point for the original landowner to reach the beach. The developer had granted an easement to whoever owned this specific property, guaranteeing perpetual beach access independent of any homeowners association. Why would that matter? Because when I read further into the HOA's CCRs, I found another interesting clause. The HOA's authority over my property was contingent on me using, quote, common areas and facilities managed by the association. But my beach access wasn't a common area privilege. It was an independent easement right. My hands were actually trembling as I realized what this meant. I wasn't bound by the HOA's rules, the same way other residents were. At least not all of them. My property had a special legal status that predated and superseded some of the HOA's authority. But it got even better. I discovered that my easement didn't just grant me access across certain lots. It granted me recreational use rights. And according to the legal description, those lots, 47 through 52, included the pathway that every single resident used to access the beach from the parking area. I paid $500 for a consultation with a real estate attorney who specialized in easement law. Her name was Patricia Reynolds, and she'd been practicing for 30 years. I showed her everything. She read through the documents twice. Then she smiled. "Mr. Chen, this HOA has made a very expensive mistake. Your easement gives you significant rights that they cannot supersede. And if they're threatening foreclosure over rules that don't legally apply to your property due to your easement status, they've opened themselves to a lawsuit for harassment and abusive process. Can I stop the foreclosure? You can do better than that. You can turn this around completely, but you need to be willing to play hardball." I thought about my wife's tears, my kids asking why people were being mean to daddy, the sleepless nights, the $1,200 in bogus fines, the threat to take my home. Let's do it. We filed everything on August 15th, 2023. The injunction, the easement assertion, the formal legal notice. Patricia charged me $5,000 for the work, which I paid gladly. It was the best money I ever spent. The HOA had 30 days to respond.
I waited. Margaret's response arrived via her husband Richard's law firm letterhead. It was dismissive and condescending. The HOA rejected my easement claims, stated that they had full authority over my property, and demanded I comply with all violations and pay all fines within 15 days, or they would proceed with foreclosure. They'd called my bluff. Except I wasn't bluffing. On September 1st, 2023, I did something that would change everything. I installed a fence. Not across my property line, across my easement. Patricia had worked with a surveyor to mark the exact boundaries of my easement as described in the title documents. The path that the entire community used to access the beach, it ran directly through my easement area. The parking lot where residents left their cars before walking to the beach, also in my easement area. At 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning, a professional fencing company arrived with materials and equipment. By noon, a beautiful 6-foot privacy fence stretched across the access path to the beach. It was positioned exactly on the boundary of my easement, professionally installed, and completely legal according to my easement rights. I added a locked gate with a single sign. Private easement, no trespassing. The first call came at 12:47 p.m. Margaret, screaming so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "What do you think you're doing?" "Exercising my legal easement rights, Margaret, just like you've been exercising your HOA authority." "You can't block the beach." "Actually, I can. My easement gives me recreational use rights over this area. The HOA's common area designation doesn't supersede my prior easement. My attorney has the documentation. If you'd like her to send it to Richard, I'm sure she'd be happy to." "This is ridiculous. You're being childish." "No, Margaret, I'm being legally precise, just like you were when you fined me for a garden gnome and tried to foreclose on my house. The difference is that my legal position is actually correct." She hung up. By 3 p.m., there were 47 residents gathered at my fence. Some were angry, some were confused. A few were cheering me on because they'd been quietly dealing with Margaret's tyranny too. Margaret arrived with Richard and 2 other board members. She demanded I remove the fence immediately. "No," I said calmly, "but I'm willing to negotiate." "Negotiate? There's nothing to negotiate. This is a public access point." I pulled out my phone and showed her the title documents Patricia had prepared. "Actually, it's not. It's my private easement. The HOA never owned this land. They've been using it under an implied license that I, as easement holder, can revoke at any time. Would you like to read the legal opinion, or should I have my attorney explain it to Richard?" Richard took the documents. I watched his face change as he read. Real estate attorneys know an easement when they see one. "Richard, we need to talk," he said quietly. "No, he's just trying to—" "Richard, we need to talk now." They stepped away. I could see Richard explaining something, his finger pointing to specific passages in the documents. Margaret's face went from red to white. When they came back, Richard spoke. "What do you want?" "First, you drop the foreclosure immediately. Second, you remove all fines from my account. Third, you leave my fence alone, the original white picket fence on my property line. Fourth, you stop the selective enforcement and harassment. And fifth, you resign from the HOA board, Margaret, both of you." "Absolutely not," Margaret shrieked. "Okay," I said. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia. She answered on the first ring. "Patricia, please file the lawsuit we discussed. The HOA has refused to negotiate." "Wait!" Richard grabbed Margaret's arm. "What lawsuit?" Patricia's voice came through the speaker loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Chen has grounds to sue the HOA for harassment, abuse of process, and interference with his easement rights. Damages would include his legal fees, emotional distress, and potentially punitive damages given the malicious nature of the HOA's actions. We estimate somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000. The crowd gasped. But I wasn't done. "Also, Patricia, please send the notice we prepared to all residents, the one informing them that as of today, all access to the beach through my easement is prohibited until further notice. They'll need to find alternative access or petition the HOA to solve the problem." Now Margaret understood. If the community couldn't access the beach, property values would plummet. The entire reason people paid premium prices to live here would vanish overnight. Homes would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars less. And it was all within my legal rights. "You can't do this," Margaret whispered. "Watch me," I said. "You tried to take my home over a fence. I'm simply exercising the same level of legal authority you claim to have. The difference is, mine is actually legitimate." Richard pulled Margaret aside again. This time the conversation was longer. I could see her arguing, gesturing wildly, him shaking his head, pointing to the documents, clearly explaining the legal reality. Finally, they came back. "If we agree to your terms," Richard said slowly, "you'll remove this fence and allow community access to the beach?" "Yes, immediately." "And you'll sign a permanent easement agreement allowing the community right of passage?" "For $1 per year from the HOA, yes. That makes it a formal agreement rather than an implied license I can revoke." Richard looked defeated. Margaret looked like she'd aged 10 years in one afternoon. "We need to call an emergency board meeting," Richard said. "You have 24 hours, I replied. "After that, the lawsuit gets filed and this fence becomes permanent."
The emergency board meeting was held on Sunday evening. 43 of the 47 households in Lakewood Estates attended. The community center was packed. Margaret opened the meeting looking like she'd been crying. Richard sat beside her, grim-faced. The agenda had one item: resolution of easement dispute with property owner at 742 Lakeshore Drive. Richard presented the facts. My easement, the HOA's legal position or lack thereof, the potential lawsuit, the fence blocking beach access, the impact on property values. Then Margaret spoke, and for the first time, I heard something other than arrogance in her voice. "I made a mistake," she said quietly. "I believe the HOA had more authority than it actually does. I enforced rules selectively and unfairly. I targeted Mr. Chan because..." She paused. "Because he questioned me and I didn't like it. I thought I was protecting our community standards. Instead, I've jeopardized everyone's property values and created a legal nightmare." The room was silent. "Mr. Chen has offered terms for resolution. He wants the foreclosure dropped, all fines removed, his fence left alone, an end to selective enforcement, and he wants Richard and me to resign from the board." Murmurs spread through the crowd. "I move that we accept all of Mr. Chen's terms," said Tom Williams, the former board president who was attending as a visiting resident. "And I want to say something else. This never should have happened. An HOA is supposed to maintain property values and create community, not become a personal fiefdom for petty tyrants. Margaret, Richard, you've both abused your positions. You should resign." The motion was seconded. The vote was unanimous. 43 yes votes, 0 no votes. Margaret and Richard didn't even vote. On Monday morning, I removed the fence blocking the beach. The fencing company I'd hired charged me $2,500 for the installation and removal, but it was worth every penny. By Monday afternoon, all documentation had been filed. The foreclosure was withdrawn. My account showed a zero balance with a credit of $1,200 for the fines they'd assessed. Margaret and Richard submitted their resignations in writing. But the story gets even better. 2 weeks later, I received a call from 3 different residents. They'd all been quietly dealing with Margaret's selective enforcement and harassment. One had been fined $850 for various violations. Another was threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fines of $1,100. A third had been ordered to remove a shed that had been on their property for 6 years. With Margaret gone, they felt safe coming forward. Patricia helped me organize a class action complaint. We documented dozens of instances of selective enforcement, harassment, and abuse of authority. The HOA's insurance company took one look at the evidence and settled immediately. Total payout $85,000, split among 7 affected families. I received $18,000. Every penny of my legal fees covered, plus compensation for the harassment. But here's the truly satisfying part. Margaret and Richard had invested heavily in Lakewood Estates. They owned 3 rental properties in the community in addition to their primary residence. Total investment, approximately $2.3 million. When word spread about what happened, the lawsuit, the settlement, Margaret's abuse of authority, the community's reputation took a hit.
Not permanently, but enough that property values dipped about 8% for 6 months while new reasonable board leadership rebuilt trust. Margaret and Richard had to sell 2 of their rental properties at a loss during that dip. I heard through the community grapevine that they lost approximately $140,000 on those sales. The Mercedes became a Toyota. The golf club membership was canceled. Richard came out of retirement to take a job at a local law firm because they needed the income. Meanwhile, my property value increased. The corner lot with the private easement, once the new board formally recognized my rights and we signed the permanent easement agreement, it turned out my property was even more valuable than I had thought. That independent beach access, separate from the HOA, a real estate appraiser valued it at an additional $75,000 in equity. My white picket fence is still there, exactly 4 feet high, perfectly maintained. The HOA has never mentioned it again. The new board president is a retired teacher named Susan Martinez. She believes in fairness, transparency, and common sense. The monthly dues went back down to $175. Selective enforcement ended. The community actually feels like a community again. My kids play in the fenced yard with Max. Sarah gardens without worrying about gnome violations. I park my car in the driveway when I'm unloading groceries, and nobody sends me threatening letters. Last summer, the community held a beach barbecue. Susan gave a speech thanking everyone who'd helped rebuild trust after the difficulties of the previous administration. People actually applauded when she mentioned that HOAs should serve homeowners, not the other way around. I saw Margaret there, standing at the edge of the crowd with Richard. She looked older, smaller somehow. When our eyes met, she looked away quickly. I didn't feel angry anymore, just satisfied. She wanted to take my home over a fence. Instead, she lost everything she'd built through her own arrogance and abuse of power. There's a lesson in there somewhere, about karma, about power, about what happens when you use authority to hurt people instead of help them. But mostly there's this: stand up for yourself. Know your rights. Don't let bullies win just because they have a gavel and a title. Sometimes the little guy really does win. If you enjoyed this story of HOA justice served, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible revenge and malicious compliance stories. Have your own HOA horror story? Share it in the comments below. Your story might be featured in our next video. And remember, always read your title documents. You never know what legal superpower might be hiding in there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.